Hello everyone, my name is Coco and I do art sometimes. I've had people asking me to do a coloring tutorial for ages now, and I'm just now getting around to it, but better late than never, I guess. Before I start, I want to share really quickly the brushes that I use for all of the coloring, which are all default Procreate brushes. If you're using a different app, any kind of textured brush should work in replacement for Old Beach, as long as it has kind of like a transparent quality and this grainy kind of texture to it, which is really important to getting that like watercolor style in a digital app. First off, I start by doing flat colors underneath my sketch with the Old Beach brush. This is pretty much the only time I'm gonna use this brush for like real colors, and so everything else on top of it is using the like hard airbrushes that you saw at the start. But this part, it's really important to use a textured brush because that way you're gonna be able to get kind of like the grainy underneath tones. You don't really have to have perfect line art. Like I just clean my rough sketch and then I work on that, but everyone has personal preferences for their stuff, so you can do cleaner line art than I did. I don't think it really matters that much though. I also really find it helpful to separate each section of clothing or skin as their own layers, since if you want to recolor something, it's a lot easier to just alpha lock it and recolor it instead of having to go through and redo the entire thing. At this point, I also think it's really important that underneath the loads to have the canvas be pure white, because this brush is kind of transparent. So if you put a different kind of color, like a lot of people like to use a gray base tone underneath their like coloring layer, and I like to keep it as pure white because this brush is kind of transparent, which means that if you change the base color, it's going to change the actual colors of the clothes. And you can play around with it and see if there's something that you like, but I like to keep it at pure white so you can see the kind of like grainy texture for your art. So after we're done with the flat coloring, I like to also color my line art. I usually stick with kind of like a red tone for skin and then a darker version of whatever the base color is for the rest of the line colorings. For example, you can see like the coat has a darker blue line art color and the skirt stays with lighter pink for the lines, and I think that really helps in making the colors flow better, especially when you start shading. I like to first go in and alpha lock it and play around with the colors a little bit, and then I'll also sometimes make a soft light layer on top of everything and add kind of like a soft pinkish light to areas that I think that the light is going to hit when I add shadows. Usually this includes kind of like the top of the hair as well as the chest area and maybe the legs a little bit. This isn't really necessary, but it's something that I think that helps just a little bit with shadows. After we do base colors, I like to tackle highlights next. This is something a lot of people have told me and like have asked me how I do, and it's really not that difficult. A lot of people seem to think that it's like just a white layer and then it's just a normal layer on top and then like color with white highlights. But the way that I do it is I make a new layer on top of everything that I've already colored so far, and then I set the layer mode to add. And I also like to use just like the hard airbrush and set it to like around 80% opacity on a light pink, and that way you can add highlights like that. And the reason I like doing that is because the highlights will kind of show with the add layer, kind of show up a little bit pinkish around the edges, which I think like looks really cool, especially with the watercolor kind of like flat coloring. Okay, so after this, I'll stop and merge all of the base color layers as well as the sketch and the highlight layers with it. I'm like really paranoid, so I like to make a copy of the base colors in the line art in case I like really mess up later and I can delete everything and just return to the sketch from zero. Trust me, it's happened before. It happens with almost every single drawing I do, and I find it so much more helpful if you already start with this so you can like kind of like be like have a fallback. Okay, and so now after this we're gonna actually start shading. First, I like to make a new layer on top of everything and then set it to soft light as a blend mode. Then we're going to take the Old Beach brush again, or whatever textured brush you're using, and then just do some light shading where the creases are and where I think things need more depth. My general rule of thumb for this is to go just like a little darker and a little more saturated than the base color you're working with, more color variation. I especially like to do this where there's like, if you're having like a white shirt or a light kind of like clothing piece, I like to shade with a darker red. using the soft light, and I found that that really helps like bring depth to it and kind of like helps you guide the hard light shadows afterwards, as well as kind of like create this like cool color variation so that you can have a little bit more like depth to your piece before you actually start hard lights. Okay. And so now we're actually finally gonna start on hard shadows. A lot of people do shadows really differently, but the way that I found that works best is I like to use a hard light layer. Again, like on top, I make a new layer on top of everything else and then stick with a dark gray, like reddish color to do shading. A lot of people use multiply layers. A lot of people use darken layers. I've found that multiply is really, really dark and it shows up very gray unless you like go very light. I don't know. Either way, I just use a hard light overlay. And it may change per app, but for Procreate, this is what I would recommend. This part kind of requires an understanding of how like light and shadows work on figures. And so I'd really recommend kind of like playing around for yourself with how these like elements work together so you can have realistic shading. One thing that I really find helpful is thinking of shades or thinking of shadows as like objects that are connected, because sometimes what I fall into like the pitfall of doing is that I'll do like separate shadows, and so I'll add shadows as like, oh, a little bit of shadow here in the clothes and like a little bit of shadow here on the face. But it's a lot more helpful if you think about it as like one big thing, like where are the shadows gonna hit and where is the light source coming from, and then what are the cast shadows based off of that. I think it's a little bit easier to tackle shadows, but again, like my stuff is not perfect, so I would just recommend playing around to your own liking and seeing how it would work for you. Specifically, I used a light source from the top right, which means that like Chiaki's skirt underneath is all shadowed, as well as her socks and like part of her shirt and hair, right? It's kind of like a bad habit I have, and I'm trying to get rid of it. But I know a lot of people do shadows from like the front or from like the front down, and that's totally cool. But in all my art, you'll see that I basically have a really bad habit of doing shadows from the top or from the top right. I had to play around with stuff more, but you know. Then everything else after this is just like cleanup and rendering on top of all of the other layers. The first thing is I like to define the lines where we applied shadows. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but I just like to add like a new layer and then have a darker version of that shadow around the edges using a hard airbrush. This kind of helps the drawing look like a little more put together and like you actually knew that you were doing the entire time, which I do not. I also clean up the edges here and apply more gradients if I need them. Again, just like with a normal layer. This is also where I actually add in like the eyes on top of the line art and add details wherever I want them. This is another thing, I have a bad habit of doing eyes on top after the end. And I like to color pick all of my color schemes from existing colors already on the figure. I feel like this is really helpful for when you're drawing stuff that has like a really set color palette, or maybe you don't really know how the colors will work together. Instead of like picking new colors, I'll just color pick straight off of the figure or the character. It's just a lot easier. Okay. At this point, I'll also just keep adding random lines and clean up stuff. This is also more kind of like just minimal fixes, because like the grainy texture from the base colors is already there. I don't really want to like shade that much on top of it, because then that way you'll be kind of getting rid of the really nice watercolor texture. So I just do really light shading or really light rendering so that you don't really have to like worry that much about whatever. My art is super messy, by the way. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. But if you're more of a perfectionist and want it to get like really perfect, then you can go crazy. Okay, so after we do some rendering, this is something I've been doing more lately and I find it really helpful. I'll make a new layer again on top of everything and then set it to the overlay blending mode. This is where you can kind of like fix the saturation and values from the flat colors in case that they were kind of too dull or didn't work together. In this case, I added like a little bit more pink to Chiaki's hair and a little bit more blue to the jacket, as well as kind of like a little bit more lighter pink to her socks and her skirt. I found that this was really helpful in helping like the colors kind of pop out a little bit more. And you can set the opacity lower. I think I lowered the opacity to like 60% or something because this layer is so like saturated. So I find it helpful to just kind of like go really lightly. It doesn't have to be that crazy, but just a little bit of change in saturation can go a long way with the finished piece. At this point, everything is just up to personal preference and rendering to your liking. At this point, I've also lately been taking a halftone brush and applying shading using that on top, just using a normal layer. I feel like it really gives this like put together effect that helps other colors blend into each other. And this is just like stuff wherever the shading is, or like to help blend in like shadows and stuff. Then I just render on top and fix highlights and lines. I'll also add sharp highlights to places that I think are like missing something, like Chiaki's skirt, because I felt it was kind of empty and I kind of want to add it to some. I kind of wanted to add something there, or to help bring the eye in, like her hair. I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind where you want to draw the eye to the piece, and that's where I'll put more detail. And the rest of it, I just kind of like will leave, because no one has time to like fully render a shoe when you know people aren't going to be looking at the shoes. Like, come on. This is again something I stole like directly from Chiwasu Hoshikawa's work. The way she does shadows is incredible, and I want her art style so bad. So I reference it a lot, and I reference the way that she does clothing and highlights. Her art is like such a big inspiration to me. Okay, I have to stop fangirling. So I finish up by just adding more highlights, especially to shadowed places, and then fixing more lines by just adding like regular colors on top. And then at this point, I'm pretty much done and I call it a day. And so that's pretty much how I color all of my art and render as well. I hope that this was at least a little bit helpful and wasn't too difficult to follow. Thank you so much if you watched this far, and please let me know if this was helpful at all. I'm sorry that this took so long to come out and that I kind of like ghosted this channel for a bit, but I really hope that this at least kind of like helped clarify my process just a little. If this helped with your coloring style, or if you tried out using this art style, please let me know or tag me somewhere. I would absolutely love to see it and see if my teaching skills are up to par. Also, hopefully I'll be able to do more uploads this year, but I'm not sure. This semester is looking to be really tough, but we'll see how it goes. If I just kind of ghost it again, which probably is what's gonna happen, you can catch me on social media. I post there pretty often and I'm pretty active, especially on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you so much if you watched so far, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, bye!